All right, Facebook Live. We are back again at RANE, and we are here to talk about cyber attacks in Latin America and their impacts on the region and businesses, households, and just general citizens within Latin America. I am Carmen Colosi. I am a Latin America analyst here at RANE. I am joined by Ali.
I am one of the two cyber analysts here at RANE. It's a pleasure to be here today with you, Carmen.
Of course. Thank you so much for having this conversation with me. I wanted to start us off with a statistic I found in my research for this talk, which is that essentially we see roughly 1,600 cyber attacks happen per second within Latin America. And so while we do know that that's not as many cyber attacks as we see in other regions, Europe, North America, for example, that Latin America has seen a significant increase in cyber attacks over the last couple of years. I'm
Yeah,
wondering, Ali, if you can speak to your experience as a more globally minded cyber analyst to talk about where Latin America stands on the global stage.
absolutely. Great statistic. I would caveat it by saying that the definitions around what pertains as a cyber attack can often be quite nebulous.
Hmm.
But and in fact, it's not necessarily true that certain regions of the world experience less cyber attacks just on the basis of their economic output, because you also have to consider where cybersecurity standards are more strong, which would be a deterrent to some malicious threat actors, versus where they're weaker. And so, in the case of Latin America, I think the important aspect of the region is overall. Is an overall lack of really strong cybersecurity standards. I mean,
Yeah.
one of the biggest one of the biggest stories that we've tracked in the last year was, of course, when Costa Rica's government was held hostage by a ransomware attack, and this was an unprecedented incident at the time,
Yeah.
and caused severe economic pain for the country, and I think really brought to light the severity of the region's lack of strong cybersecurity controls. And of course, anytime threat actors, like especially financially motivated groups like ransomware actors, see this kind of obvious weakness in a region, they have a tendency to all flock and exploit that. We saw that in the case of Australia, where one data breach occurred about a year ago, and then it sort
Mm.
of just opened up this big like hack after hack. It was called like the Great Australian Hack, because
Wow.
essentially threat actors caught wind. And so in the case of Latin America, I think
Do you
again
think
on
that there
kind
is
of
a
yeah.
potential for something like that to happen in Latin America? Australia, it's a fairly developed economy. Would there be that same interest from a hacker's point of view to go after not just government but also the private sector in Latin America, considering that it's the region as a whole is developing and not so developed aside from a few different
Yeah,
countries.
yeah. Threat actors are extraordinarily opportunistic, and
Hmm.
so I think if you saw strong economic development in the region, again to your point about Australia being a very well developed economy, that this was very much um, a reason for why this hack developed into what it was, which was several weeks long incidents, and that's because a lot of these companies were extortable, and so you would be able to speak better to the economic conditions in Latin America. But threat actors are going to exploit targets that they can receive either ransom or any other kind of extortion from. I think
Hmm.
one more interesting aspect of the Latin America region is hacktivism. And
Definitely.
hacktivism is a topic that we cover heavily in the context of the Russian Ukrainian war, which of course is very appropriate given the amount of activity we've seen in that region and in correlation with the war. But one of the most fascinating hacktivist groups is this group Guacamaya, which means macaw parrot,
Mhm.
and they're a group that has dedicated themselves actually to environmental hacktivism, which
Yeah.
again is another really unique lens for, and not only environmental hacktivism, but their baseline mission is to protect the indigenous land of Latin America. And the way that we've seen this happen is not only hacks against a lot of Western oil and energy companies,
Hmm.
that's been a big, really interesting focus of theirs, but also just unveiling some of the corruption in various Latin American countries. Mexico was targeted very heavily. There were over like 10 terabytes of, which is a lot, of data that was, and again, this also though goes back to cybersecurity standards, because while there's no knowledge about how sophisticated this group's capabilities are, their ability to hack into not only really highly classified Mexican material, but also Chilean and Guatemalan and Colombian government, military, and intelligence information, suggests not so much that they're probably extraordinarily sophisticated, but more that a lot of these countries are not um, don't have great cybersecurity standards around this really sensitive material, which is a problem for Latin America. But
Completely.
this group has been really big into sourcing out some of the corruption that in these various countries. And I know that you've been following this election that has the runoff on Sunday, and I know that corruption is a big topic, right, with the candidates. And so I was wondering, from your point of view, um, do you think that concerns around corruption are, I know that this has been an endemic problem in the region for a while, but
Yes.
from your coverage, do you think that there is any kind of real concerted push to combat this? And I'd be curious if you think that these activities by these groups, which are to unveil the degree of corruption and other malign activities by these government officials, is really any kind of surprise to the citizenry and will really have any impact on either social movements against corruption or any other kind of real tangible impact. I don't know if there's
Totally.
the demand
Totally.
for it. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So, just yeah, I think you're referring to the Guatemala election on Sunday. We've seen in many of these Central American countries, specifically, I'm thinking the Northern Triangle, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, that all three of them have seen their populations really focus on wanting more and more anti-corruption efforts. And so I think that with that, we see actually a fair degree of public support for these hacktivists, specifically the Guacamaya group. And because of that, we've seen a lot of protests coming out, just after information has been released online. We've seen a lot of, when once information is released, we've seen a lot of public push on the government to get rid of corruption. There's this, always we're going to see, some degree of corruption within these countries. It's something that has been a problem for a long time, and that's not going to go away with the trend of hacktivism. But I think that it's going to lead to these, more widespread protests, more, we could see more and more having these cabinet shuffles as certain ministers are being deemed or accused of corrupt actions. And so we could see a significant amount of actually political turmoil coming out of these hacktivist efforts to oust corruption, which of course in any anti-corruption effort, there's going to be a hurdle of getting over the fact that there is going to be a little bit of political turmoil in that's just inherent to any and all anti-corruption efforts.
Yeah, and another worrying trend on this conversation about cyber means for political either change or overall influences. We've seen a fair amount of increased activity in Latin America for influence for hire firms. This is something
Yeah.
pertaining to the Guatemalan election, which you are now covering, and state surveillance systems. The amount of spyware deals that have been conducted between Latin American government officials and companies like Pegasus or the NSO group, which is responsible, it's the Israeli firm that created Pegasus, which is the most well-known spyware on the market. We've seen those deals skyrocket in the last few years, and there's been a huge interest by Latin American political leaders to get access to these really advanced non zero click spyware tools, which for our audience, zero click means that there's actually no victim engagement needed whatsoever for this malicious spyware to be implanted on targets' phones, which are often journalists or other members of the media, as well as political dissidents and journalists. I already said journalists, but like a lot of activist groups. So I'm
Totally.
curious, yeah, what your long-term thoughts are on how that intersection of digital surveillance capabilities will further undermine any real push to combat corruption
Yeah.
or overall democratic freedom in the region.
So we've seen that exact technology being used in places like Mexico, some Central American countries, against journalists that are, specifically critical of the government. A main concern that I and many others that follow Latin America is that this technology will fall in the hands of some of the region's dictatorships or countries that are moving away from democratic trends and their democratic institutions, and that by using this type of technology to identify critics and to be able to more easily silence them could be a way for Latin America to slip from its currently majority democratic institutions into more authoritarian states. I think one of the places that we're looking at right now is El Salvador. Specifically, when we're looking at this type of technology as to whether or not it's being used, a country like El Salvador, if they are using that information against that type of technology against their journalists, critics of the government, that's something that we could see that actually hasten the pace at which the country goes from democratic to authoritarian. And
Yeah.
on that really lovely note, that is all the time that we have for today. Ali, thank you so much for joining me. This was a fabulous conversation, and you can read more of our cyber coverage, more of our Latin America coverage, and more coverage on cyber in Latin America on our website at ranenetwork.com. Thank you so much, everybody.